Hello, everybody. My name is Tanja van der Akker from Forza Advies, and happy to welcome you to the webinar, What the Top 10% of Change Leaders Do, together with author and speaker Patrick Mayfield. Once again, welcome to our webinar. Today we'll talk about what the top 10% of change leaders do and what they do differently than their less successful colleagues. What makes them successful? In a moment, I will introduce you to Patrick Mayfield, and I'm very honored that he's joining us from the UK. But first, some practical items. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will monitor the chat during this session and answer them as much as we can during the webinar. Questions that remain will be answered at the end of the webinar. This session will be recorded, and we will make the recording available afterwards. If you have enrolled for this webinar via our website, you will get an email with the link. And if you have enrolled via LinkedIn, you will see the link on LinkedIn. Of course, it's noon here, the first Monday of the month, so the alarm goes off. If you are enthusiastic about this webinar, please share and comment it in your social media so that others can enjoy it too. Thank you very much in advance for that. And now it's time to introduce to you the speaker of today, Patrick Mayfield, and I'm very proud that he's joining us. Patrick, how are you?
I'm very well, and the honour is all mine to be speaking at your event, Tanya. Thank you.
Great. Can I say how we met? Just a moment. Patrick
Yes,
and I
please do.
met on a change management course in the UK, which I took with his ATO, Accredited Training Organization. And by incident, Patrick only conducted part of the course, but it made a lasting impression, and we stayed in touch ever since. So, Patrick, you're going to tell us today about what change leaders, the top 10% of them, do differently. And it's partly based on your work for the stakeholder engagement certification that we carry. And you're also one of the authors of the change management certification. So just a little bit of background for our viewers. May I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I no longer run a training organization. What I do these days is I write and I coach. And what I want to do in this session is really to show the origins of the book, Practical People Engagement, that became the source reference for the international qualification in what they call stakeholder engagement. It's an interesting journey, and I just want to say that there's good news and there's bad news, but let me give you the bad news first. The bad news is that what I'm about to share, much of it, is not out of my expertise, but out of failure, trial and error. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that if I try to lead change by winning arguments as an expert, I'm almost certain to fail. But much of what I'm about to say, therefore, might seem like management heresy in your organization. If this gets too much for you, you can log out. No blame, no shame. But this message, I feel, in modern management cultures is really quite radical. But the good news is it works, and any of us can do it. So, Tanya, if you can show us the first slide, please. Yeah, one of the acid tests, I suppose, of a well-led change is, does it stick? And I've got 6 statements here. In a moment, Tanya's going to give you a poll to engage with, and I want you to say which ones you agree with, which ones your organization actually does, and which ones you don't agree with. Here's the first statement. We deal with change primarily as a technical problem. The second statement is the change is owned by the most senior manager. I think the language we use, the jargon of methodologies, management methodologies, is senior responsible owner, and that comes from the UK Civil Service, the most senior person involved in the change. Number 3, we respond to resistance by argument and by authority. Number 4, we primarily support the stakeholders by training. Number 5, we follow up the initial push with more resources. And last, number 6, we'll hover on that one for a moment. When we are successful, we celebrate as a team. Now, I'm not asking you necessarily which ones you believe in, but which ones do your organizations actually do here? If they don't do any of them, say no to all of them. If they do all of them, say yes to all of them. And it might be a little bit of each. Tanya, I want to give our delegates a few moments to think on this now.
Yeah, we'll give them a few moments to think about this and to check what's actually happening in their own organizations. So the last one seems maybe more positive than the other ones, or?
It does.
But we don't want to spoil we don't want to spoil the survey, of course. I'm sorry. We tell jokes in the same way in our family. We tell the punchline first and then the joke. So.
Yes, we've got family members like that as well.
I'm looking to our assistants here. Do we have any? Do we have response coming in? I see a finger go up. So please, if you haven't done yet, submit your answers into the poll. I can do this in Dutch as well. So, dus als je deze poll ziet, geef aan voor welke organisatie, of voor jouw organisatie, welke van deze stellingen waar zijn. Dus welke stellingen hiervan herken je in jouw organisatie? Het gaat er dus niet om of je het er zelf mee eens bent, maar of je denkt dat ze waar zijn en kloppen voor jouw organisatie. Okay, so we got answers coming in.
That right there is interesting.
Oh, yeah, we need to give it a little more time because I see more answers coming in. Yeah. So now I feel like the lady on the election day with pointing out which ones are winning and which ones have less votes. Oh, and it's still changing. Great. What a wonderful tool this is. So currently, the first is when we are successful, we celebrate as a team. I hope I didn't influence that one.
Okay, that's good.
Second one, we deal with change as primarily a technical problem. And the third, we respond to resistance by argument and authority.
Yeah.
Then the change is owned by the most senior manager. And we follow the initial push with more resources. Oh, then they're changing again. So the first three are now tied.
Okay, so could you read out the first three again?
Yeah. I think we'll leave it as this. The change is owned by the most senior manager. We respond to... I didn't foresee this. Okay, technical problem is 1. Senior manager is 2. Argument authority is 3. Celebrate as a team is 4th. And we primarily support the stakeholders by training is 5th. And 6th is we follow up the initial push with more resources. And it's still changing. It's hilarious. We didn't foresee this.
This is about adaptive change, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. So
this
can you
really
see them, Patrick?
Yes, I can. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay, so would you like us to switch? Yeah.
Yeah, this for me is research, I think. What we're going to do as we go through this presentation is I'm going to pause at certain points to take any questions or comments or disagreements in the chat. That would be good. So if we could go into the rest of the slide deck, please, Tanya. If we could have, that's it, thank you. So here we've got our 6 statements, and some of you may not be surprised at this, but if you can click on this, Tanya, I don't agree with any of them, now having done the research. Now, this may be what your organizations do at the moment, but I'm suggesting that this is not the right way to engage with people. Next slide, please. Because it all began way before the book when a colleague of mine, John Edmonds, and I decided we were having a chat, an expansive conversation, and we were heavily into management methods like Prince2 and managing successful programs and portfolio management and so on. And we were heavily invested in these. In fact, I think both of us had written pieces of those methods from at one time or another. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be good to externally validate some of the messages in these, some of the practices in these methods, by first of all finding out where the high performers were. We'd been given this concept by a book in America called The Alpha Project Managers, this idea of a small minority of people who do things differently. And so our research questions was, what do all change leaders have the same mental crib sheet? That is, internally, what is their checklist? What are the order of things that they do things in? What are most important to them as they perceive them? And so we were looking for what the top 10% say, but more importantly, what do they actually do? So we constructed this research over a 6-week period. We, in the end, had over 120 people who were subjects of our research, change leaders, program managers, project managers. Not just yet, Tanya, we're not going to those yet. We were beginning to we had these people over 6 weeks. We would give them questionnaires each week, depending on what we discovered, and we would be looking primarily at their practice. And to qualify for this, we had to have access to their line managers, their bosses, their senior managers, because we wanted to independently validate what they did. We all have a psychological bias at times where we think we are above average. I say we all. 96% of people have this view on whatever skill area, whatever experience area. Now, if you think about 96%, how can that possibly be true? It should only be 50%. So we all think we're better than we are. So what was really important was we looked at what they actually did. Next one, please, Tanya. So we found certain patterns in our superheroes. They weren't shared by 10% in this research, they were 5%. We call these people the positive outliers. This idea that we all, as a large population of change leaders, would be on a normal curve in terms of our mastery of leading change. Some very poor, low experience, then you peak in the middle and then you come down. It's the ones who are leading the curve who are the positive outliers. I'll come back to that term later if we need to. Next slide, please, Tanya. So we found a pattern of 3 things. The first one was, in terms of what we looked at, in this pattern of 3, you'll see these 3 icons go through. The thumbs up is that, and that's made of little people. I don't know if you can see that. All of these people showed in their diaries are leaning towards people. The second one, well, I'll explain the second one in a moment in terms of that puzzle game. But the last one really goes deep. These people were reflective. They were self-learners. So let's have a look at what we discovered about leaning to people in the next slide, please. Let's have a look at this next one, yeah. So what we began to track was the actual weekly log of their work. We weren't so much interested in the number of hours they worked, but rather how they spent the hours as a change leader. And what we were particularly interested in was the choices they made. Many of us have our week cluttered with tasks and meetings that we just have to go to. That's not what I mean by proactive time. Here we are talking about what people choose to use their time. Now, both the control group and our positive outliers had time in their working week where they could choose to do whatever. But what was interesting about the control group, next click please, Tanya, is that they only spent, we're talking here about the 95% of our population, they only spent between 10 to 20% of their discretionary time, their proactive time, in talking to people, in moving towards them in relationships in some way. Whereas with our positive outliers, it was stark, it was really different. Let's say that you're a manager and you can find over a working week 4 hours where you can do what you choose to do. The control group might spend 20 minutes in talking to somebody in that 4 hours, on average. The positive outliers, though, would spend most of their time moving towards people. That was so stark. We moved on to this. This is not what the book said. This is not what we wrote about. Next slide, please. Here's what one of our positive outliers said. Notice the language. It's very deliberate. It's very intentional. And this is an interim program manager. That is someone who is an independent consultant who moves in when there's a gap, when there's a role to be filled temporarily. Say the program manager goes on maternity leave and is having a baby. They need to fill that position. So the interim manager, program manager, really needs to hit the ground running quickly. And this person said, I made it my business when I arrived here to immerse myself in the business community, to understand who was who and how they functioned. Very illuminating. As you probably noticed, we adjust our styles when we're dealing with different people. This is one of the key learnings of this particular positive outline. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sure those of us who've been brought up through project management training, and I include myself in this, have seen this. The good old time, cost, scope triangle, and you might have quality in the middle. But I call it the scarcity triangle because essentially this is about trade-offs. If you are running out of time, how do you do this? You spend more money. Or if you're running out of time, you reduce scope. And there's always seems to be a trade-off between the three edges of the triangle. You know the old joke, a planner says that if they want to produce a baby not in 9 months but 1 month, they get 9 women to do it. No, that's stupid. So let's have a look at the next triangle. I hope I'm not offending people by my English humour. But anyway, here we go. This is the triangle I prefer, the risk-benefit stakeholder triangle. If you look at the bottom end, the person, the individual, the group, who is looking at the change that you are inviting them to be a part of, they first will look at the risk, and you need to begin to help them see what the benefit is, not just for the organisation, not just what the business case contains, but also what the benefit might be to them. This is a much more powerful triangle, I think, in terms of leaning to people. You are beginning to use a high order empathy where it's really about looking through the eyes of your stakeholder. How do they see the world? And shock horror, it may look very different to how you see it or how your executive board sees it. So let's come back to those statements. Next one, please, Tanya. Perceived ownership of the change. This is a familiar convention, a familiar trope in management methodologies. It's always owned by the SRO. Where did that come? It came at number 1, didn't it? Or number 2? That may be so, but I would submit that a better, more radical way is, Tanya, if we could you click again, please? The stakeholders themselves are encouraged to own it. You just think for a moment, if you've had any experience in leading change, there can come that magic moment, that beautiful moment when suddenly the people who have been resisting your change suddenly grab hold of it because they see some benefit. They see some benefit for themselves. They see something beyond the change, beyond the pain, and they begin to contribute better ideas. Ideas that we can embrace. This is a better way of owning change. Let's have a look at another statement, please. Yeah, the initial push is followed up by more resources. Well, I noticed that in our quick poll, that wasn't very popular, or it wasn't very common. But I often find that, again, using the scarcity triangle, if the change is running out of time, people will throw more cash, more money into it. A better way is this, Tanya, that the stakeholder contributions, that we look at what we can adopt, that they come up with as ideas. This is all part of the ownership narrative. And then we get out of their way. One of the best things we can do is to protect them. This is where I believe the senior responsible owner comes in. One of the best things a senior responsible owner, a senior manager can do if they head up a change team is to provide what they call in the military air cover, to protect the change from interference, particularly within the rest of the organization, and to let the people get on with it. So I don't know if we can go on to the next slide where we talk about this little puzzle, Tanya. Click again. I don't know if we want to pause here, and are there any questions that people want to ask me before I carry on?
Not at the moment, Patrick, but we keep
Okay,
a
I'll
close
crack
eye
on
on
then.
the YouTube chat. So please, if you're watching and you have any questions, submit them in the chat, and my colleague Vera will give us a signal, and we will get you your question into the webinar. So please do so. Thank you.
So what our research began to surface for us was a pattern of three. This is the second of the pattern of three. And I use this little game to illustrate it. You've all seen, let me just put this in front of the camera. You've all seen a game like this. And what I do with that, and what we do, everybody intuitively knows that the idea is to sort the numbers. Well, yeah, thank you. It's so difficult doing this counterintuitively, but the numbers, and you just sort the tiles through. Well, one of the problems we come up with again and again in our organizations is what I call the factory model of management. It's the idea rooted back in about 1926 onwards, where we became obsessed with efficiency and time and motion and using resources well. So looking at that tile game, we see the gap there. And with that mindset, that factory model mindset, the idea is, oh, there's a gap. We could fill that. We could get more resources in. But as soon as you do, you lock that in a rigid state. I'm really pleased to see that there's a rise in agile change management now. But this comes back to a very personal level for our positive outliers. It's all very well building in Float or Slack or Margin in a team, but what we found was that among the positive outliers, they would defend their proactive discretionary time. They would put boundaries around it. Let's have a look at the next slide, a quote from another of our positive outliers. This was a program manager of a rail company, and he said, unplanned events, the surprises, were manageable, as I had allocated approximately 6 hours for various forms of unplanned activity. This was an interview after we'd seen his timesheet, and this was sufficient to cover what came along. Now, that's so obvious, but how many of us allow stuff to fill up our working week? So in the end, we have got no free time. Well, in fact, we did ask the majority, well, what do you do if something unexpected happens? And they said, well, we work late, or we work weekends, or stuff just drops off the end of our to-do list. We will never get round to it. I would say that this is a much more thoughtful, intentional, robust, resilient way of managing our own working week. Let's have a look at the next slide. And this is not from a positive outlier, Tanya. This is from, this one is from one of our control group, a portfolio manager from a police authority. And he said, the study made me think how reactionary I am for most of the time. I think most of us can remember moments in our career when we were like that, just fighting fires. So let's come back to the next slide before we go on to the last one. Oh yeah, sorry, there was a little bit more on that last slide. Could we just go back? That particular individual only spent 15% of their time proactively. 15%. Not enough, I believe, if you're in a senior position like a program portfolio manager. Tanya, do you want to come back with any questions in the chat?
I guess firstly, Saskia mentioned that the British humor is highly appreciated, so keep on going with that.
Great.
And
Do you know,
second,
can I just say, I feel the closest affinity to the Dutch in terms of our humour, even greater than the Americans. Yeah.
so we got that on tape now, Patrick.
Oh yeah.
Be careful of what you're
this
saying.
is going to go viral or get cancelled.
I didn't see this question in the YouTube chat, but it's a question of mine because on a daily basis there are a lot of urgent signals that need to be handled or seem to be handled, need to be handled right away. So it's very seductive to keep on going in your mailbox, and now you have chats and messages via Teams. Before you know it, the day is done. And as you mentioned, the most successful change leaders don't let their itineraries be itineraries, only use words that you can pronounce, are not steered by that. What can you recommend for people who feel overwhelmed and who feel reactionary like this person from the police authority?
If I may, I would like to answer that in the third pattern, which I think is very relevant to that question. But I just want us to notice something very odd here, very structural, which is to do with the fact that we've got something that we used to call business as usual, but in our disruptive age that we seem to be getting deeper into, where there's constant change, change isn't such a distinctive anymore, but it used to be. And yet, we used to use business as usual mindsets for leading change. How stupid is that? In systems theory, change is always going to be a social adaptive problem, not a simple causality problem. So we mustn't think of change like a task list. Did you want to ask anything else from the chat, Tanya?
No, not at the moment. I was signaling. I thought it was out of the picture, but no, I see no questions via the chat via Vera. So you can continue your presentation.
Okay, well, let's go on to the third pattern then, shall we? What our original research question, if we can have the next one, is our original research question was around personal dashboards. You know, did everybody have this mental crib sheet checklist in their heads that they were operating? And were they all the same? And did they confirm Prince 2 and MSP? Well, this was the real shocker. The first thing was, Tanya, we can have the bullets on this, that they do exist. Yeah. In fact, they were able to tell us what those internal checklists were very easily. The problem was they were all different. I'm wondering what that might tell us. But we noticed something else. The control group, when we asked everybody to give us their top 5 priorities in any change, the positive outliers did that with ease. They rattled them off. Control group really struggled to get to 5. There seemed to be something going on, particularly when we interviewed them, that the positive outliers didn't just have a presence, but they had an internal clarity. Next slide, please.
If I may, Patrick, we have our first question from our audience, from Saskia. Thank you, Saskia Schijf. So what to do, she asks, if you are not reactive, but you need to work in an organization that is reactive? Is there any advice that you can give on that?
Yeah, I've got stories, and I'm not sure there's time to tell these stories. I'll tell you what. I will tell the story of the HMS Gloucester, a British cruiser that was part of the Allied fleet in the in the Arabian Gulf during the First Gulf War. And it was the night that the Allies had invaded to liberate Kuwait. And there were various missiles threatening the fleet, and there were bombers coming over from aircraft carriers to land or to the land to attack the enemy and to return. In HMS Gloucester, their role in the fleet was simple. It was to monitor the air traffic and to detect if there were any surface-to-ship missiles coming. And so the B-12 bombers from the American aircraft carrier were flying back on a certain flight path. And one of the radio operators was towards the end of his 12-hour shift, and he was about to return to his bunk for a well-earned rest. And just then he saw a blip on his screen that didn't seem quite right, but it was following the same flight path as the B-12s. This operator had 90 seconds to make a decision. And what happened was that he wasn't sure, but he knew something in his gut wasn't quite right. It didn't seem to look like the pattern he'd seen with the B-12s, but he only had moments to decide whether to fire a ship-to-air missile to bring down this suspected enemy missile. But it could be a B-12, and then he could actually end the lives of 2 crewmen on that B-12 bomber. This is modern combat for you. In the end, he fired. And he ended his shift not knowing whether it was an aircraft or whether it was a missile, and went back to his bunk. Of course, he couldn't sleep. Later that night, he was told, "You made the right call." What was really interesting, though, was that this officer, this operator, had made a call, and they had a recording of his radar screen. And they spent something, not 90 seconds, but 200 hours analyzing it to see what the difference was with the blip of a B-12 bomber. And this human being had become so well trained to react that in the moment they trusted their instinct. Now, I'm not sure how well this story goes in your reactionary organization, but I'm saying that there is a skill development that you can develop, that you can get behind, where your intuition will tell you if there's something wrong. But even on this webinar, we scheduled an hour, did we not, Tanya, to prepare for this? We had an hour's margin. We used all of it up to connect my laptop and it wouldn't connect. So that's why Tanya is doing the slides. Now, what would have happened if we hadn't allowed for that margin? This webinar would have been disastrous. It's just good practice. In a reactionary organisation, they ought to value margin. They ought to value that discretionary time because you get better at problem solving.
And
I don't know if that
practicing.
helps. Yeah.
Practicing, and
Shall we
preparing.
move on?
Yeah, sure.
Come back to me if you want to take issue with me on that story and example, but let's have a look at the next slide. This is what I call the Slack Iceberg. So we have our marginal Slack. This was visible to us as we looked at the timesheets that were returned by our subjects in our research. But that's the only visible thing. Like an iceberg, most of it's under the surface. If we can have the next one, please, Tanya. What we began to see in conversation was that this gave our positive outliers personal agility. Last year, I read a great book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb called Anti-Fragile. And I would have used the language of anti-fragile. The positive outliers are anti-fragile because they have built in this kind of growing ability to deal with greater and greater problems. Next one, please. But even deeper than personal agility, all of our outliers began to show us in conversation that they have a professional curiosity. You see, those of us who are driven from one crisis to another, who are just trying to get through the day alive, who just trying to knock off all of the jobs that we have to have done before our boss screams at us, we've got no time for curiosity. This is a complex problem and we must have curiosity. And what that gives us is what psychologists call self-efficacy or agency. Suddenly we become powerful. How do we do this? Well, let's have a look at a couple of quotes from our positive outliers. I don't put issues immediately onto the log. That's heresy in terms of Prince 2. This is evolved from experience. You see, they're talking about reflecting on their practice. They've taken the time to reflect on why that wasn't working. I found myself spending too much time administering controls and not actually managing. It may not be what the books say, Patrick, but it just works for me. Well, good on you, program manager. Next one, please, Tanya. And this is really where self-awareness, because that's what we're ultimately talking about, being aware of ourselves and the way we're working. This program manager said in a government organisation, with my organisation 2 years, it's getting easier to work with the wider community, working with a good senior sponsor. Can you see the power of relationships there? The job gets easier as people learn that you value them. And how do you learn that? You learn it by reflection. Next one, please, Tanya. So here's another of our statements. The mindset in approaching change is it's a technical problem. You put that number 1, guys. Well, I don't think that's right. I think you probably have guessed my answer by now. A better way is to treat it as an adaptive social system. Technology will always give us new challenges. We've got the rise of AI at the moment. It's still technology. But we're going into a future where we really need our brains switched on, where we're engaging and connecting with people. Sometimes people who are not otherwise regarded as key. Next one, please, Tanya. Another statement here. Resistance, but beliefs and behaviors are countered by argument, logic, command, and the superior expert. This is where I show up and say, I'm the author of Practical People Engagement. Listen to me. No, that's not going to work. It's better with something called somersault questions. I'll explain what that means in a moment with a quick story. Or other people in the group that you're trying to lead through change, telling their stories of how they successfully done it. And it is about stories. It's not about reason. It's not about showing them a cold business case. It's about talking dreams. It's talking about dystopia. It's talking about how we get better and what it might be like to work in our organisation once we've got this improvement. Some sort questions quickly. You're talking to, this is 1990. I want you to think back to 1990. You're in a village and the chronic problem is child malnutrition. Since the Vietnamese War has ended with America, there is now no foreign food supplies helping Vietnam. And it's a big problem. 20% of children who have been weaned and are under 7 are seriously ill or dead. So what do you do if you've got no resources? Well, one third world development guy called Jerry Sternin and his wife Monique had built up trust by helping out in this village to the point where they could feel free to ask the villagers if they could weigh their children, because body weight by age is a really good indicator of whether young children are nourished well enough or not. So he shows them this graph and they're all intent on the results, all the carers of the children, all the parents. And he asks them this question. He doesn't ask them which ones are chronically ill. He asks them, are there any children here who are not children of parents who are in the Communist Party and so getting food sources from other places? Are there any children here whose parents are not members of the Communist Party who are putting on weight? Yeah, they were saying yeah, and they pointed out the ones. And then Sternin just got those carers to do cookery classes for the other carers. And over a six-month period, without any external resources, he set up 10 cookery classes up and down the length of Vietnam. And the Vietnamese authorities allowed him to stay because it was beginning to make inroads into child malnutrition. That's the way to do change. So, forgive me if I got a little bit preachy there, but let's just go back to the pattern of 3, please, Tanya. So we've got the first one, values, relationships, and connections. If there's anything our world needs right now, whether it's in business or not, is that we esteem each other, we value each other, and we move towards each other. And we don't demonize and cancel each other. The second one, please, that we learn to protect our personal margins, not just as part of emotional well-being, physical well-being, but because it makes good career sense. And the third one is self-awareness to agency, where we begin to write things down. I wrote a book later called Leading Yourself, and someone asked me on the seminar, well, how do you lead yourself? Every day I write a journal and I reflect. Every evening I reflect on what were my 3 wins today? What did I learn today? What will I do differently? As Socrates said some 2,600 years ago, he didn't write, but he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So guys, let's examine our lives. Let's have a look at the last slide and then I'll take some questions, Tanya. When we're successful, we celebrate ourselves. It's good to celebrate, but here's a better way. I have a friend who heads up a charity in the UK which takes ex-offenders coming out of prison who are usually drug addicts, and over a 6-week program takes them through. And the stories that they tell are amazing because every 6 months he holds a graduation ceremony and it goes viral. And you know, it doesn't just affect the other clients, but affects all members in his management team, everybody who works in his organization. When they hear these stories, they suddenly realize what is the point of what we are doing. And they tell these stories to others. So how about this? Yeah, let's celebrate ourselves, but let's celebrate the real heroes, the people who come through the trauma of change. Tanya, any more questions?
No, not at the moment. So we can give it a few moments for people to react. I've just mentioned in the chat that, of course, the questions can be asked in Dutch. I don't know if that is any threshold to ask your questions. So please feel welcome to submit them in Dutch as well. English is fine.
And
Dutch is
I won't
fine.
take offense if I have to re-explain something because of my English. So
Yeah.
if that was a problem.
No, that I don't think so. And no questions yet. I really liked the presentation. It made me think, as we spoke before in our preparations, about Venice, being your own teacher, being your own coach, and
Yes.
each time identifying where you feel you could be better, and try and find learning experiences as well to improve. So picking your courses, picking a coach,
one of the things I would just emphasize is that isn't beyond the reach for any of us. We didn't do any IQ tests on this research, but my view was that any of us can learn this. Any of us can do this. This isn't limited to some elite kind of human being. This is stuff. We can be our own teacher. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and the other thing that it made remind me of is the expression of Caroline Walker, who said, "You're showing your priorities with what you spend your my apologies. You're spending your time and money on." And it was something I'm thinking about regularly, but I still don't get it aligned yet. That I feel that I'm spending more time and money on other items than my top 3 priorities, such as a friend that you don't see that often, but you value really a lot.
Yes. I mean, I think with our methods, quite rightly, a lot of effort goes into intra-team communications. But what I focused on primarily this morning or this lunchtime is the individual, you and me. And another writer, Benjamin Hardy, has talked about this in terms of taking our lives to being more effective is we must begin to focus on the 20% that really makes a difference rather than the 80% that's just distraction, clutter, stuff we could actually delegate to other people because they would be better at it.
True. So that reminds me of the Eisenhower matrix, but that's maybe something else. We have a question, so I'd like to give that priority at the moment. What speed bumps did these 10% leaders encounter and then concluded they were on the right track? Saskia, thank you. Thank you, Saskia. You're a really active listener here. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I think the first thing is I need to think about this because that wasn't a question we asked people. Could I have the question up so I can see it, please, Tanya? Because I think that's a really good question. What speed bumps do these
top 10%?
Let's see if I can get rid of the chat. So yeah, did these 10% change leaders encounter and then concluded they were on the right track? I don't know. We did not ask them that. But here's one thing. I began by saying that most of my career was based on, most of what I bring is based on failure and experiments that were wrong. I think I am being more effective now. I think I am learning. I like to call myself a lifelong learner, and I quote someone called John Wimber who said, "I hope I grow up before I grow old. My children tell me I'm too late." So I would say that this is part of the self-reflected learning. It's the way you treat failure. Do you treat failure as a disaster or as something valuable? Very little failure in life is disastrous, truly disastrous. And I've been through some bad ones. I would suspect that our 10% change leaders are not immune from it because we're all human and because we are engaging in a complex world that verges on the chaotic at the time. I think that's all the wisdom I've got to share on that one at the moment.
Okay. Switching to the last slide here.
Thank you,
for
Laura.
that. Thank you for your answer. That was Saskia. As no further. Oh, we got a question. No question, but a thank you for organizing this webinar, and Patrick for sharing. Well, Patrick, I would like to thank you as well for your wonderful stories, and it was a lot of fun preparing this, even though last minute we had to go to Plan B. And we had some technical challenges, but it was wonderful to do this with you. And thank you very much. If you would like to know...
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Could I just say something? I mean, that's the wrong slide. We ought to have a slide celebrating Força et Vis.
I thought I'd ignore it.
Because these guys in the Netherlands are champions of people-oriented management training and qualifications, and you run both of these courses. You also run, do you run Agile Change?
No, not yet. So we have change management, the APMG change management certification, and we have the stakeholder engagement. We have facilitation, but we do not yet have the change agent, change agile. There are many certifications coming out, and we try and pick.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's been a tremendous, there have been tremendous advances in, say, software development, which has really led a lot of these management methods. But essentially, what we've been talking about here are human beings, and there are timeless issues here that we're almost seduced to ignore in our management cultures. If we can just get these right, they will work for us. On my particular offer here, if you would like more on becoming a positive outlier and the steps that you take, visit my website, patrickmayfield.com, and you'll get a free copy, one chapter every month, and look forward to the conversation with you one-to-one.
Thank you, Patrick. And so we're going to close the webinar now. If you have any questions regarding change management or stakeholder engagement or this webinar in general, please feel welcome to contact us via the channels that you know. I want to thank you for your attention. It was great to see this number of viewers again. And the recording will be made available in a couple of days. So we hope to see you again, either on the next webinar or with questions or on our one-on-one. Thank you.